Yes, good evening, good morning, good afternoon to our listeners wherever you are in whatever part of the world. Welcome back to Indaba. We are beginning our first edition for 2026, and we're here again after a significant break, and we are on some serious issues as usual. So, welcome, my brother, Shabaka
Greetings, greetings,
Kambon.
Dr.
I should
Fergus.
say my senior brother, not in age, but my senior brother in the communications business. And of course, you are free to join us at any time in the show. Please text us on WhatsApp. The number is at the bottom of the screen. Send us a message. We are going to bring you into the show from time to time. We are discussing some very important issues this evening. So we will begin with the Africa report. We have an issue that has been haunting us for quite some time with respect to African here, or we can say African aesthetics, African values. And we are going to talk a little bit about that. And the big item, the big topic for this evening, of course, is what concerns all Caribbean people for the past few months, and that is the criminal abduction and kidnapping of our Venezuelan neighbors, the president of our neighbor, President Nicolas Maduro, and his wife, the First Lady of Venezuela. And of course, we all feel sad that Trinidad is complicit in this crime. Of course, our government is at the center of this thing. We have not had any clarity on that, but it is with a heavy heart that we discuss this because we are part of the problem from a governmental point of view. So, welcome, my brother Shabaka.
Yes, brother. So
And
a
of
lot
course,
to
I should
talk.
say Happy New Year. Huh? I forgot
Happy New
to
Year.
say Happy New Year to our listeners and viewers. Happy New Year to
Happy New
everyone.
Year.
Yes, Shabaka.
It's not as happy. It's not starting off as happy as I'd like it to be. First
Well,
of
we
all,
have
I
to
want
make
to.
it so. That's part of the struggle. Huh? We have to make it so. We have to make it so. That is our struggle. We have to work towards that.
Yeah. So I just first want to articulate my utter disgust at the developments that have taken place at the school in South Trinidad where hair discrimination against people of African descent or African people has reared its ugly head once again. I want to, I give credit to the Emancipation Support Committee for issuing a press release in which it states, and I'll just quote two sentences, that we reiterate that transforming negative social perceptions cannot be addressed merely by ministerial guidelines to teachers and administrators of education. The underlying causes of such negative perceptions and actions must be addressed. And it goes on to say the ESCTT calls for the cultural retooling of our teachers and education administrators, supported through targeted workshops and facilitated learning sessions led by competent practitioners to help translate the policy from text into consistent everyday practice. I think those are two of the most important points of the ESC's release. And they go back to a statement we issued some years ago, Dr. Fergus, from the Caribbean Freedom Project, where we pointed out very clearly that the broad guidelines issued by the PNM's Minister of Education at the time were no match for the entrenched racist beliefs around African hair in our society. And of course, I will quote from that press release, which we issued at the time. We said that broad guidelines are no match for the transnational, false, and fundamentally racist belief that Afro textured natural hair and associated hairstyles are inherently messy, unkempt, unhygienic, disruptive, and not suitable for formal settings. We went on to say that the insidious nature of this deeply ingrained idea, encapsulated in the popular phrase bad hair, is rooted in the colonial past when Europeans assigned human worth and social status using themselves as the somatic ideal. And now, before we leave this segment, and I know this is not what we are here to discuss tonight, I must blame we must put blame on the PNM administration and how it approached this issue, how it dealt with this issue, how it sidelined the main stakeholders, including the Emancipation Support Committee and the Caribbean Freedom Project in deliberations, and came up with these broad guidelines and no kind of program to support the retooling of teachers, the re-education of children to help them to understand the responsibility and the transition that they were involved in, the historic transition that they were involved in, the decolonial process that they were part of. All of that was completely ignored in the rhetoric and designs of the minister at the time, who excluded us, let me remind the public, from the stakeholder meetings, even though we had pioneered this issue for decades, even though we had, written to the Ministry of Education on numerous occasions, speaking to the issue, calling for meetings and deliberations, and those requests were disrespected. When it was time, when the pressure mounted to such an extent that they had to make a change, they made a weak and poor change. And we said that this is exactly what would happen. And I also have to criticize our own organization, our own sister organization, the Emancipation Support Committee. I don't think we did enough when those regulations were put out by the ministry. I don't think we took a firm enough position. We articulated the fact that there were problems with the regulations and that this would happen. We knew this would happen. We said it. But our organization, our leading, the organization that leads on behalf of African people, that African people depend on to protect them from these kinds of issues, at the very least, must do more to ensure that this kind of thing doesn't happen. And knowing what we knew at that time, I don't think we did enough, and we need to take responsibility for that. So I'm going to put that out there into the public, and we're going to have to do more at this point in time to ensure that this is not part of our ongoing future. Because if we don't solve it now, we're going to be dealing with this 3 months from now, and then 3 months from then again.
Yes, well said, my brother. So we move on to the first segment of the program.
Yes.
Yes, so that's the Africa report. And what I did was a general update of events since the last report. Well, not since the last report, because I had an overview of the year as the two last reports for the year. So it's really since November, what has been happening on the continent. So much has been happening that, of course, I had to be selective. And I hope you agree with me that some of these events and happenings, what you would also have taken on board as the most important events that grab our attention on the continent. So, without further ado, I would ask Renee to bring up that report. It's about 10 minutes long, so let's get into it. Simply updates. I had some issues with the program that I use with my phone and all of that.
Authorities say they blocked a plot aimed at Ibrahim Traore.
That was Kenya's PLO Lumumba. This first Africa report for 2026 is mainly an updating of some of the major events and developments since November 2025. The 9th Pan-African Conference was held in Lomé, Togo from 8th to 12th December with some 1,000 participants. The conference had a strong reparations and decolonization agenda. Included in the latter was an interesting panel on decolonizing the map of Africa, a theme previously addressed on Indaba. One of the final resolutions adopted was that the Togolese government draft a resolution to be submitted to the United Nations General Assembly with a view to adopting a resolution on reparations and restitution. But this significant event was overshadowed by continent-wide analyses and commentaries on the impending military attacks on Venezuela and Nigeria by the United States in both corporate and social media. Notwithstanding America's imperialist grandstanding, bullying, and contempt for international law, Nigeria's Pan-African visionary entrepreneur, Alan Onyema, was materializing the centuries-old Pan-African dream of bridging the Atlantic by launching regular connectivity by air with its diaspora in the Caribbean. The flight departed Lagos in early morning on the 21st of December, arriving at its first Caribbean destination in Antigua 9 hours later. According to the ticket schedule, the next stop was Barbados about 3 hours later. The flight returned to Lagos and Accra on the 30th of December. Passengers in economy class traveling from Accra paid 3.6 million naira, which is about 2,400 US dollars, using the exchange rate of 1,400 naira to 1 US dollar. The Lagos Barbados leg cost 3.5 million naira, while business class cost 6.8 million. The history-making, island-hopping return of airpeace to the Caribbean was not without teething problems, mainly concerning visa and immigration, which affected mainly passengers intending to continue on to Jamaica and Trinidad. While airpeace and Caribbean governments were working to resolve their diplomatic entanglements, the Revolutionary Confederation of Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger were holding their second summit of leaders in Bamako, Mali, on the 22nd and 23rd December to review progress made since the formation of the AES Confederation and to plan the way forward. At the first summit in Niger in 2024, Assimi Goïta was appointed the first president of the AES. And at the second summit, he handed over the Confederation's presidency to Ibrahim Traoré, the youngest of the three leaders. Many believe that under a Traoré presidency, the AES could expedite transformation of the region and inspire more nations and peoples to assert true independence or even join the AES. Prior to the Bamako summit, a joint regional military force of 5,000 elite troops was established, of which Traoré said, the decision must be followed by large-scale operations in the coming days. Not surprisingly, U.S. and French interests in the AES intensified, including heightened drone surveillance, economic sabotage, U.S. strikes in northern Nigeria, close to the border of Niger, and another attempt to assassinate Traoré immediately he became AES president. The hired assassins were made to confess on national television. They unequivocally implicated Lieutenant Colonel Paul-Henri Damiba, the former short-lived military leader of Burkina Faso, as the mastermind and financier. Exiled in Togo, Damiba's subversive activities in a neighboring country were a major embarrassment to the Togolese government. On 12 January, Burkina Faso delivered a request to Togo for Damiba's extradition. Surprising to many, just 4 days later, Togolese authorities arrested him, and on Tuesday this week, he was extradited to Burkina Faso. Or, as the Togolese prefer to say, he was expelled from the country. Having hosted the 9th Pan-African Conference a mere month earlier, this expulsion or extradition is exemplary Pan-Africanism in action by the Togolese government. According to the Togolese Justice Ministry, Burkina Faso had promised to ensure, quote, physical integrity, dignity, and fair trial rights of Mr. Paul-Henri Sandaogo Damiba and the absence of the death penalty, end of quote. The implications of Togo's judicial cooperation with the AES could be far-reaching for all West Africa. It should be a wake-up call to the government of Ghana, which currently hosts American drone operations out of Kotoka Airport, which poses an existential threat to the security of the AES. During the Bamako summit, the AES launched an independent news network, the Alliance of Sahel States Television. The station has been described as, quote, a means to counter disinformation and promote the bloc's interests, end quote. 2 days after the AES summit, the peace of Christmas night was violently disrupted by a U.S. warship in the Gulf of Guinea, which launched 16 Tomahawk missiles at various sites of alleged jihadist camps in Sokoto State. Many see the strikes in northern Nigeria near the border of Niger Republic as a possible rehearsal for activities against the AES. Other analysts, however, thought that it was possibly a prelude to the invasion of Venezuela. The strikes on Sokoto achieved no political or military advantage to Nigeria, but they did enrage several jihadist brotherhoods into more widespread and more brazen attacks. 1 week after the U.S. kidnap of Venezuela's president Nicolas Maduro, President Cyril Ramaphosa, an old thorn in Donald Trump's side, hosted a week of naval exercises involving navies of South Africa, Russia, China, and Iran. The Cape of Good Hope remains one of the world's most strategic trade routes. Ramaphosa's message was unequivocal that South Africa would not be a piece of cake for the taking by American jingoists. Notably, the flawless presidential succession in the AES occurred outside the caricatured European electoral democratic frameworks, and in sharp contrast to the endemic rigging and farcical elections in many paper democracies across the African Union. The most recent being the presidential elections in Guinea on 28th of December, the parliamentary elections in Benin Republic on 11th January, and Uganda on 15th January. In Uganda, 81-year-old Yoweri Museveni, who has ruled Uganda over the past 40 years, was returned to the presidency to continue his dynastic rule through what he described as, quote, the most cheating-free election since independence, unquote. Disagreement on that view is widespread inside and outside Uganda. I will conclude this Africa report on a lighter note. Africa's most prestigious and lucrative football tournament, AFCON, the Africa Cup of Nations, which ended on Sunday, 18th January. The tournament comprised 24 national teams playing at 6 venues in Morocco from 21st December to 18th January. In the semifinals, Senegal defeated Egypt while Morocco defeated Nigeria. In the playoff for third place, Nigeria defeated Egypt in extra time. And in the finals, Senegal defeated Morocco 1-0, a game that delivered not only first-class football, but unusual drama on and off the field. Sports writer Ed Dove, writing in ESPN, describes the game, quote, an astonishing emotional AFCON final, end quote. 2 to 3 minutes into extra time, Senegal's defender Abdulah struck the net with a header, but the goal was disallowed. Less than 3 minutes later, a penalty was awarded to Morocco, triggering a walkout by most of the Senegalese players and coach, but followed by an emotional return for the penalty to take place. Winner of the tournament's Golden Boot, Brahim Diaz, did a Panenka-style shot. Senegal's goalkeeper, Edouard Mendy, wasn't fooled and collected it like a deserving gift. Nigerian communications expert Colin Udo laments, it's absolutely the worst penalty I have seen in my life. That missed shot was only the beginning of Morocco's nightmare. Within seconds, Senegal's Pape Gueye scored the lone legally allowed goal. Colin Udo describes it a karma penalty. But the real historic star of the match was Senegal's captain, Sadio Mane, who refused to abandon the game and begged his teammates to return to the field and fight to the end with dignity. But karma was on their side, and the rest is football history. Senegal won the game, but Sadio Mane won the hearts of the continent and the global football fan club. The final whistle, however, may yet blow. If FIFA President Gianni Infantino's threat that Senegal could be stripped of the title materializes, time will tell.
Yeah, so
Yes,
much
so
to say.
there you have it. That's the Africa report, the first of 2026. I would not comment except to say I had some real challenges uh, making this particular Africa report. The app seemed to be working very differently. I don't know if they did something to it in terms of update, but there's no Zoom available, no very few text choices and no credit rules, so I couldn't credit, my sources as I do as usual at the end. I hope they forgive me if they see the content displayed, but I just could not. And several other challenges. My phone wasn't, communicating with the computer, and all my videos that I cut were on the phone, so I had to transfer them by Bluetooth, which took forever sometimes. Once it was over 30 seconds, sometimes it would stop when about 90% was downloaded, Shabaka, and I had to start all over again. So it's
Wow.
several hours just getting these things together. Yeah, that's it. But it was done just in the nick of time. I completed it. And, yes, so that is it. Hope
Well,
I don't
Doc,
have to encounter that again for the next one. Yeah.
having said that, for the viewers of Indaba, let me just celebrate the content, and to thank you for the research and the work that you've done. There's so much in the politics, and I think we're gonna make those connections when we move into the next segment of our show. But let me just touch on the football at the end. One of the comments that has come up in the international media is this match has been such a shame for Africa. It's put a stain on African football and so on. And for me, that's the most despicable formulation of the event. The event was fantastic. It was a real, for once we had a match. We haven't seen a match in such a long time that had so much drama, that really, glued people to their seats and so on. So it was from the point of view of a spectacle, it was awe-inspiring. And on top of that, though, the idea that if there's some chaos in a football match on the African continent, it's a shame for African football is in itself again obscene, because we see so often chaos in European football, and nobody ever says that it's a stain on all of European football. It's a stain on the club. Maccabi Tel Aviv comes into town and they riot and they make it's a stain on the club. It's not a stain on European football. The British hooligans are at it again. Why don't they use the same rhetoric in Europe that they use in Africa? This is, the old colonial problem, rearing its head again. So I want to denounce that type of talk, right off the bat.
Indeed, Shabaka, and by condemning it that way, of course, they hope perhaps, that Africans would not turn away from the European brands, European tournaments, and so on in order to watch African football. Sometimes, the objectives are very sinister, so, and they build up on those things, because partly it's about the economics of football. Huh? If you watch more African football than European football loses some of its value. Yeah, but it was a great tournament. I was actually thinking about Gabri when I was making this. You wouldn't believe. I was thinking about Gabri and his great potential to be a national footballer and perhaps even greater. Yes, so we are ready for the next segment, and we want to welcome two stalwarts of geopolitics in the Caribbean. Brother David, welcome. And of course, Brother David is no stranger to Indaba. I think he may be taken as one of the hosts of the program just now. But David is an economist and political activist. He's committed to social justice and the transformation of Trinidad and Tobago, and that's what he's doing here. Because transformation includes talk, includes, of course, confronting the power structure. He is a leading member of the Oilfield Trade Union. He, for 4 decades actually, at the helm, not the president, but he was at the helm, I believe, Secretary General of the Oil Workers Trade Union and the labor movement on a whole. And of course, not included in his bio, I want to say that he's a host and producer of the social media forum Talk with the MSJ on Tuesday evenings, and I would invite our listeners to tune into that very important program. Last topic they had was zones of special operations, crime suppression against solutions to crime and violence. That was the last discussion this week. And Professor Emerita Dr. Carole Boyce-Davies is a Trinidadian. She's joining us from the US, I believe. Correct me if I'm wrong. I think this is her debut on Indaba. Again, correct me if I'm wrong on that. And because I believe this is a debut, I would do a more intensive introduction. She is the chair of the English department at Howard University. She's an H.T. Rhodes Professor of Human Letters, Emerita Professor of Africana Studies and Literatures in English at Cornell University, the US. She has written several books that I consider seminal books. And she has written, for example, Left of Karl Marx, The Political Life of Black Communist Claudia Jones. Of course, Claudia Jones is one of Trinidad's heroines. She has written the classic Black Woman, Writing and Identity, Migrations of the Subject. And her latest publication is Black Women's Rights, Leadership and the Circularities of Power. And of course, she has written extensively. Anybody writing so many books would have written even a larger volume of chapters and articles and so on, which would be too much to mention here. But of course, I want to mention this again. It's not in her profile that I was given. I recall Dr. Boyce in Jamaica when Tony Martin launched his book. It was, I remember that exchange between Carole and Tony. It was the launch of his book, but it turned out to be something like an extensive interview and a conference, and like a conference one on one, like a 60-minute kind of thing event. That was such a dynamic thing. It impacted me. I went to read that book, every line of that book, because it was perhaps Tony's first major work on what we can call a feminist a feminist heroine, and Carole would not, of course, take any slides to the many offensive statements or statements considered offensive in that book. It was drama. It was a heated exchange at times, but I learned from that, and of course, I went to read the book even more critically. So that is perhaps the most interesting encounter that I have had with Dr. Boyce-Davies. Welcome to the program. We have a very important discussion this evening. We are looking at the abduction or kidnapping of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro and the First Lady. We are looking at the bombing of the seaport, which resulted in over 100 casualties. We are going to analyze the impact of U.S. military aggression, not only in Venezuela, but the Caribbean, the kidnapping of a head of state, and of course, concerns for the sovereignty of the Caribbean. Is there something as sovereignty? Does that really make any sense in today's world, especially in small island states such as ours? So, without further ado, I would let Shabaka introduce the session and begin the interview.
Yeah, well, I think, Dr. Fergus, I think you've started in a very good place, because the question right now around the world is, whether or not we are witnessing a rupture in international law, in the international rules-based system. And, the Caribbean has always been a place that has played a kind of central role in major transformations in the world. And perhaps the question is, are we again right at the center of this rupture? And we can start with Dr. Carole Boyce-Davies. And by the way, Dr. Boyce, before you enter, let me just say that I just came back from a seminar on climate change where I was talking to a young Rhodes scholar, and I asked him to give me two of the books that he recommends most highly in this world. When I discovered he was a Rhodes scholar, and of course he said Left of Karl Marx.
Wow.
So cheers to you. I had to take a chuckle there.
Wow.
So
Yeah.
yes, so over to you, Dr. Boyce.
Just saying that book is, I think it's really on the way to become a classic, which is a great thing. Because I went to Nairobi last year for a book event, part of the Swahili Book Prize that I'm on the board of. So one of my colleagues, Makoma Ngugi, the son of Ngugi Wathiongo, that is organized a reading for me at a bookshop called Chichi Book. The place was packed, and people were just reading Left of Karl Marx, and they had amazing questions. So that's really, this is not me. This is the power of the person. And of course, I was just a channel to make sure her work got out there. Claudia Jones, that is. Anyway, where does one start with this? I had started to write something called a semi-colony. And it was really because I was trying to understand the nature of the current, not just Caribbean, but Caribbean and African post-independence relationships to the United States. And I went back to two sources. One was the Lenin's piece on neocolonialism and imperialism, and the other was Kwame Nkrumah's piece on the same thing. And then another important one was Claudia Jones, who had written a piece, and I want to recommend it to your audience, 1958. Definitely try to find it because you'll be able to Google it. And it's called Imperialism and the British West Indies. So basically, Claudia Jones, at that point, 1958, just around the time when we were moving into independence in the Caribbean, at that time was really worried about what she saw as American imperialism having a stronghold in relationship with the British, right? And she points this to the Anglo-American Caribbean Commission, which was founded in 1942, and which ironically Eric Williams was leader of, and then later on, of course, abandoned. But basically, she said that the growth of American economic and political influence in the West Indies was facilitated by this Anglo-American Caribbean Commission. And basically what happened was that when we got independence, and this explains this semi-colony, neo-colony thing. I don't even want to call it neo-colony. That's why I call it semi-colony, because I see a real semi-colonial status, was that basically when we got independence, it was a negotiation not with the Caribbean, but between England and the United States for control of the region. So this is what Claudia Jones was talking about, and she was really worried about it. And she actually pointed to a number of reasons. She said, for example, there are a number of factors. And of course, the fact that American imperialism was at that point on its sort of rising point, she felt that we were in a danger zone, as many were, when they assumed that leaving the British or whoever else, French or the Spanish, and going to the American would be like a safe point. A number of Caribbean, other Caribbean scholars, including Amy Cizé and others, made the same caution. So basically what we're seeing unfolding is something that was in place already, and then all they had to do was pull the lever and do it. And I mean, there's several other things I can say about this, but I wanted to at least begin there, that this is not new, that the American Imperial Project to grab the resources from the Caribbean is real. And what Trump is doing is just really saying publicly, because he doesn't have filters, he's just saying publicly what America has been doing anyway, either covertly or overtly, and he's very overt. And interestingly, he doesn't care because he's moved on land in other places because he has a different kind of larger imperial desire that he wants to unfold. I wanted just to begin with the fact that this is not new, that this was built in technically to the Caribbean Independence Project, which was not really independence, it was just flags and so on and all of that. But the economic controls which define a neo-colonial project as defined by Nkrumah, by Lenin, would be identically what we see unfolding now. And therefore the US, all it had to do was sort of activate. The sad part of it, and we can come back to this later, is how Trinidad has been positioned there, because Trinidad, as you know, has global branding as one of the leading nations which sort of launched Caribbean Pan-Africanism. And I really, my friend Tony Martin is such a loss that he's no longer with us, because he really worked that theme really well. So basically, this is a sad point for us because we are known for producing Pan-Africanism, from Sylvester Williams, right? The Padmore, C.L.R. James, even Eric Williams and Capitalism and Slavery, Stokely Carmichael, Claudia, we can just list them. And we have numerous interviews where people ask us, what is about Trinidad that produced that many dynamic leaders? So for me, this is such an insult from the current leadership that it would debase that history so radically, where people around the world are thinking of Trinidad as the one country that facilitated the capturing of Maduro and the bombing of Venezuela. This is the most horrendous aspect of that we would be in a position where a leader from the Caribbean would actually be facilitating or have facilitated such a thing to happen, such a horrible nightmare in the Caribbean. Because this is like the end point, isn't it? Where the US can use its might, just go in and grab whichever leader they want. And once they have that model down, it's not far-fetched to think that they will not try to do this in other locations. And people are on guard because they're like, where next? Is he going to try to do the same thing? So I'll stop here and let my colleague David enter this discussion.
Yeah, Dr. Davies, thanks for giving us that historical context. And David, before we go deep into the issue, perhaps I think we could take this opportunity now to speak directly to our brothers and sisters in Venezuela. We know there are over 100 people died. We understand that nation is grieving. People have been on the streets since that very day that the kidnapping took place. Let's just speak to what's happening on the ground before we get into the our analysis of the situation.
Yeah, thanks, Shabaka, and Dr. Claudius, and Dr. Carole Boyce-Davies. Yes, I mean, what is important for us to hear and know is that there is a lot of mass defiance of what in Venezuela of the U.S. attack on their country and the kidnapping of their president. So there are many demonstrations almost every day, with thousands of people coming out and demanding the return of their president who was kidnapped, and the First Lady Celia Flores. And that information isn't necessarily coming out to the public in the way it ought to. So I'm glad
David, let me just interrupt
yes.
you with a question. One more question just to add to this here. One of the most interesting things that has come to the fore since the kidnapping of the President Maduro is the notion that Senora Machado is not very popular in Venezuela. Up until that point, she was sold to the world as the popular leader who had been marginalized illegally and in other ways by President Maduro and his regime, to use their language. And in fact, when he was kidnapped and she was now looking for that support to go into power, the American administration said publicly she just did not have the support. And this is something, again, we who had been, myself included, who had been an election observer, one of the things we saw, and we said this publicly when we came back from Venezuela, having gone to the main rallies of both the government and the opposition, there was no comparison in the size of those two rallies. We didn't feel, and we said this publicly, even though we couldn't say definitively that there was nothing wrong with the elections, we could say definitively that Maria Machado did not have the kind of popular support that she was being extolled, that was being proclaimed on her behalf in the international media. We saw it with our own two eyes. It was 5-1. The government rally dwarfed her rally by 5-1, 5 times as large, or 7 times as large as her rally. But Doctor, let me give it back to you. Let me give back the floor to you.
Yeah, well, all of that narrative about her, and then of course getting the Nobel Peace Prize and so on, all of that was part of a carefully crafted narrative to justify, and to project that there would be an alternative when there was regime change in Venezuela. And the person who threw under the bus was nobody else but Donald Trump himself, when he publicly said, no, I'm not dealing with her. She doesn't have the support, and she has no power, and she doesn't have the support. So he personally threw under the bus. And so a number of things have emerged. And let me also say that in addition to the 100 Venezuelans who were killed, some of them being civilians, not all of them were part of the security forces or the military. A number of them were civilians. There were 32 Cubans who were killed. And that has created a tremendous wave of nationalism and solidarity within Cuba when the bodies of those 32 compatriots were returned a few days ago. So that's something else that we have to also recognize and pay attention to. Now, the thing is that there was supposed to be regime change. What came out was the US was able to do one thing with their technology and their military power. And that was they were able to kidnap President Maduro and the First Lady. But they weren't able to do anything more than that. In other words, they couldn't take out the other leaders in Venezuela. They couldn't destroy the military hierarchy. They couldn't get the masses of people to who are supposed to be supporting the opposition to come out on the street and demand regime change and support the Americans. Because what is also significant is that and you remember, Shabaka, when we were outside the Venezuelan embassy on the Sunday morning, the day after the kidnapping of President Maduro, one of the journalists was asking the Venezuelan ambassador, what are you saying about the images of people who are supporting the US in their actions? And then I asked the question, where those images from? And then he said, well, CNN and so on. I said, well, no, not the media house. Which cities are you seeing those images coming from? And then he said, well, from Argentina and Chile and Miami and so on. And I said, have you seen any coming out of Venezuela? He had to say no. I said, but what you are seeing are people coming out of Venezuela in support of President Maduro and calling for his return and against the US military attack. So and there have been no mass protests in Venezuela calling for the US to come back in or to remove Delcy Rodriguez or the leadership of Venezuela. In fact, what has happened is that beginning of January, quite coincidentally, the National Assembly was sworn in because there were elections for the members of the National Assembly, their parliament, late last year, and they were sworn in and they took office. And then the Supreme Court ruled that Delcy Rodriguez is the temporary or interim president because the president is still alive. President Maduro is still alive. So he's still the president of Venezuela, but he's not physically in Venezuela, can't carry out his functions, and therefore the vice president would assume those responsibilities. So the institutional arrangements, constitutional bodies are functioning in Venezuela. Obviously, the government has to negotiate certain things with the United States, because one of the things I remember raising very early on with that naval presence, massive naval presence in the Southern Caribbean, was not only the military attack, but a naval blockade of Venezuela, similar to what happened with Nicaragua during the first period of the Sandinista government. And so said, so done. It's effectively a naval blockade, to some extent an air blockade, but particularly a naval blockade. And that has impacted upon the Venezuelan economy. So they have to find ways and means now of dealing with that. But what we also need to repeat all the time, and you know this, Shabaka, from your own visits to Caracas recently, that Venezuela is producing close to 90% or more of its own food needs. So they have sovereignty in terms of their food security. And last night, I don't know if Carl was on that webinar done by our friend and colleague out of Jamaica, Professor Anthony Bogues, who's at Brown University now in the US. But he was talking about sovereignty in the Caribbean, given what has been happening. And he said that one of the areas that we have to insist upon sovereignty to ensure that we have some element of sovereignty is with respect to being able to feed ourselves within the Caribbean. Because if we can't feed ourselves, then we're going to be totally dependent and so on. And Venezuela is able to significantly feed itself. So they can continue to defy the US in many respects in that regard. So
Yeah,
that's
so I
my
think
first comment about sovereignty. I mean, we have to look at some of the international law issues that Claudius has raised. Yeah.
We're going to transition to that now, but let me just note what you just said there, reiterated for our listening audience. I mean, one of the things that I heard a Venezuelan officials say the last time I was in Caracas, jokingly, but it had some serious element. He said, listen, if they keep the sanctions going, blockading our economy, stopping us from importing and exporting, eventually we will produce absolutely everything we need in Venezuela. Because he was pointing to the fact that Venezuela has actually used this as an opportunity to become more and more self-sufficient. And of course, you're not going to see that in the international press. You're not going to see all the different types of things that are now being manufactured in Venezuela that, tended to be some things that we just simply imported before. So very interesting development that the only thing I would take issue with in your statements is that the United States could not have gone further with their invasion or imperialist objectives. I think they did exactly what they wanted to do. I'm not sure the outcome is going to be what they thought it would be, but this was the strategy I think that their president wanted, and we're going to see how it unfolds. But let's get now into the analysis.
Well, just one on that quick point, Shabaka. I think that might have been the strategy that the military person said was possible, given the reality of Venezuela and the U.S. militaries and so on. Because boots on the ground there would have created a whole different scenario with a lot of body bags going back to the United States.
Okay, Doctor. Yeah. So let's look now at the consequences for the region, for the world. What does this mean for us? What do Caribbean people have to be aware of? What do they have to be cognizant of at this time? Dr. Davies, perhaps?
Right. Carole? Well, I would say first, definitely leadership ideologically is very scattered. And that part of it, people need to be clear that some of the leadership is acquiescing or separating out. So we don't have a sort of unified Caribbean leadership that really pushes back against U.S. imperialism, which was probably one of the only ways that we were able to survive with this long without anything else happening. But once we had that rupture, you can see that because of that rupture, they were able to come in. Had that rupture not been there, then I would imagine it would have been harder. It would have been not possible to really do what they did. So I think we need to really be clear. Caribbeans need to be clear about the leadership they're selecting for positions of power, because therein lies some compromises that we see evidence of happening, with the most extreme version being the Trinidadian prime minister who did that. So fortunately or unfortunately for her, she has gone down in history in a very negative way. So if she thought this was going to go down well, all of the reports I've seen about her globally are not positive, they're negative. And people are horrified that this person, particularly as a woman, and I've written on women in leadership, would approach leadership with that really dated patriarchal acquiescence, sort of bowing down to the masters, as it were. So I think, first of all, leadership, and people have to be really clear in selecting leadership, what the outcomes can be, and be very careful about that. That would be one of the main points I would want to make about this. And hopefully we will correct what happened in Trinidad to not have this repeated again.
Yeah, Dr. Davies, Brother Abdulah has been very outspoken in his condemnation of the Prime Minister's actions. Perhaps, Brother Abdullah, you would want to add something to what Dr. Boyce-Davies is saying?
Yes, Shabaka. Yeah, I mean, I've said quite clearly that Trinidad and Tobago and the Prime Minister has been seen to be a lackey of Washington and of US imperialism. And I mean, last Friday in the Parliament, I think it was last Friday, the Prime Minister doubled down again and made statements to the effect that she got legal advice, but she didn't say from where, and she didn't say what the legal advice was. And the Attorney General similarly said something at a press conference to the effect that, as far as they're concerned, it was totally legal for the United States to engage in those boat strikes and to kill people, when everybody, including, conservative people in the United States, media, former military people, have said those are extrajudicial killings. Europeans have said so. These are not progressive radicals like us in this program. They've said it's extrajudicial.
Brother Abdullah, I'm looking at the chat groups in St. Mary's, Fatima, some of the old, most educated, upper middle class, upwardly mobile young men and women in the country. And it's interesting that when the supporters of Ms. Bissessa, our Prime Minister, get backed into a corner, their argument is that, well, Trinidad is better off. We're safer because we took an unprincipled stand. How would you respond to them?
Well, basically, it does not work.
Yeah, both of you, please. Wait in.
Carole, go ahead.
Go for it. No, I was going to say it doesn't work like that. This particular U.S. government doesn't have loyalty on those grounds. I think the question of achieving their interests, and I mean, the U.S. has always indicated its U.S. interests first, right? This is not in our interest, this is in our interest. Basically, if it was in their interest to work with her to get what they needed, once that's done, she's over. Honestly, she's over. They have gone on to other things. He wants something else. So it's like if you use yourself to be a doormat, people walk on you and then they go in the house and then that's it. So I'm so embarrassed for her that she actually thinks that this was a positive thing and that Trinidadians really believe that. And I have to tell you, Aldo, and I'm, growing up in Trinidad with all the questions of racial identity, but I have seen such horrendous, offensive things on social media that people of Indian descent have said. So we have to really make a distinction between conservative, right-wing policies that come out from certain mouths, Black and white, Asian, whatever. But we have to really be clear that there's a political line that people cross over when they want to really support a position, whether or not it's something that is in their best interest or not. And that is the scary part, because is it in their best interest to just assume that the U.S. is really going to take care of you? That is not, it has not been borne out. And people mention Puerto Rico. Keep in mind, Puerto Rico is a U.S. colony. They have tried for independence. They would love to be where Trinidad was before this particular leadership. So basically, Puerto Rico, with its 2 to 3 million people, still struggles for rights. I mean, so what happened to them during the hurricanes? Look at what happened to them when they come to the United States and still run into U.S. racism and so on. So keep in mind that the assumption that being a colony of the U.S. is going to give you all these benefits. Check the people from the Virgin Islands. Talk to them. Go there and see how they really live. And then look at what Trinidad has been able to achieve by itself for so many years, and only to be debased in this way by the current leadership.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm just saying, I mean,
okay, let me jump in a little. Let me jump in a little before, and David, you can address it at the same time as well. I find that there is a sort of obscene silence to the obvious criminal violations of international law, crimes against humanity, the killing of we have to say innocent people because they had not even been arrested or charged or anything on the high seas. And while political leaders are also silent, but you'd expect at least the opposition leaders in the Caribbean to take advantage of this. But it's not the case. And I wonder if there is some other stranglehold on our leaders, political leaders, whether in government or in opposition, that we are not aware of, such as visa. For example, we know how powerful this visa revocation is right now, perhaps even stronger than sanctions. And I wonder if the silence has to do with the fear of the US revoking your visas. The Caribbean, as we know, is very much still under European colonization, and yet there seems to be either a fear or complicity from the other European the colonizers about what's going on. And the question, of course, is what is there for them to benefit from with what is going on, since Trump is also threatening them, in so many different ways. But what I want to ask is this directly. Because of time, but the psychological violence aspect on it, David, is worrying. And I think besides the military physical violence, there's an element of psychological violence that has taken hold of the Caribbean as well. But I want to ask this question. How unique is the kidnapping of Maduro in particular? We know his wife was also kidnapped. How unique is that in terms of modern history? Kidnapping of a sitting head of state. Noriega, to me, is not an equivalent because Noriega was not an elected president of Panama. Strongman, he was described as, but strongman is not a constitutional title, right? So the kidnapping of Noriega was a different sort of international law issue as well. So how unique is this? Can we point to any other examples? Aristide was almost in Maduro's situation, but again, that was different. It's not an equivalent, right? It's not an equivalent. How unique is this? And I'm asking that question because if I think there's a case for taking Trump, Rubio, and the other major players before the International Criminal Court, despite the fact that the US and Venezuela are not signatories. But there must be some international mechanism to bring these guys to book. The Security Council is not enough. We know that how they control this thing. So could you speak to those things?
Well, that's a whole lot of many things to speak to.
Yes. That's my mind just going around,
Yeah, sure. No, but I mean, on behalf of the Assembly of Caribbean people, I drafted and we sent a letter to the UN Secretary General and to the President of the General Assembly on some of these very issues. Now, the reality is, I think, I know you or Shabaka made the point earlier, that the US essentially under Trump has torn up the post-World War II settlements with respect to international relations, and therefore the US now no longer respects or has any regard for the UN Charter,
Right.
because what they did by attacking Venezuela was a clear violation of Article 2.4, which says that no state should, all members shall refrain in their international relations from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state, or in any other matter inconsistent with the purposes of the UN. And the kidnapping of a sitting head of state is contrary to international law. And the International Court of Justice, I think, not the International Criminal Court, but I think the International Court of Justice has made a ruling, which is a body of the United Nations, made a ruling on that many years ago, that you cannot kidnap. Well, let me be clearer. You cannot try for a crime in another country a sitting head of state. In other words, what the US is doing by putting President Maduro on trial in a court in the US is illegal internationally. He could be tried before the International Criminal Court, because that's an international body. But Trinidad and Tobago, for example, can't try the Prime Minister of Ohio for a crime that we think they may have committed. That is wrong. They could only be tried before an international tribunal, which is international criminal court. And so the US is violating totally international law. And kidnapping a sitting president is also a total violation of the UN Charter and everything else. But Trump doesn't care. I mean, if you heard some of what he said today at Davos, right? And said, listen, we are going to, NATO owes us, the Danes owe us, Greenland owes us, we're just going to take it. And we won't do it by force, but it has to be ours, because everything in this hemisphere we have to control. And, he said it, and Carole is right, he has no compunction, and maybe that's a good thing. As we say in Trinidad, he has no cover for his mouth. So he will say exactly what is on his mind.
Right. But keep in mind, too, that the U.S. At this point in time has sort of not, they had, in many of the United Nations instruments, they did not ratify or sign on to. And people are really surprised. When I teach Black women's leadership, students are surprised the U.S. was one of 2 countries or 3 that never signed or ratified the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, Convention Against the Rights of the Child. So the U.S. has been operating outside of a lot of these international mandates, with the sense that they could do whatever, and then operate. And of course, having all these military bases all around the world gave them this sort of logic of dominance. But keep in mind, and I think it's really important to say this, because this has come up recently with the ICE abuses of people in Minnesota and other locations, that is a kind of logic of policing, both internally and externally. So his logic is maybe he could put even troops in the United States cities and have them really manage people. It's a kind of rogue government. We have to really be clear about that. And we already know that historically the US model of segregation influenced all of these horrible racist structures around the world, including apartheid in South Africa, including Hitler's Nazism, including Australian treatment of indigenous peoples, including the Israeli encircling and dispossession of the Palestinians, and of course the more recent destruction of Gaza, seems to be, to me, part of a whole other spectrum of understandings of how this government has worked with abusing rights of people around the world. So the question of rights and human rights that we assume to be the normal aspects of United Nations practices, the US is out of that. So I really have been arguing from the start that actually your prime minister, she is more subject to being brought before international court for the kinds of things she has said publicly and the acquiescence she has had, particularly the famous statement, kill them all violently. I mean, she is documented as saying that. So Trinidad is a signatory to some of these international conventions. So he may get away, and he doesn't care. He's like 80 years and he's on the way to whatever. But she's really positioned herself really dangerously as it relates to some of these international conventions. And I would hope that somebody would bring a case at some point that would implicate her as well, because of what complicity in this horribleness.
Yeah. And the irony of that, Carole, is that the International Criminal Court became a reality because of the advocacy of former Prime Minister A.N.R. Robinson.
Right.
He tirelessly campaigned for it and ensured that there were enough signatories for the Treaty of Rome to bring it into being. So we were central in that development. And yet, we have the behavior of this prime minister now. But just to add to the point, I mean, just after the U.S. Kidnapped President Maduro, they withdrew from 66 international organizations, including more than 30 UN organizations, including the UN framework for on the way climate change. I mean, they're withdrawn from the Paris Climate Accord, but the overarching framework they also withdrew from that just a few weeks ago. So as far as Trump is concerned, there's a complete rupture. And interestingly, the Canadian Prime Minister said as much at Davos yesterday when he said this is not a transition, this is a complete rupture with that essentially post-World War arrangements and multilateralism and international rule of law. I mean, the unilateral imposition of tariffs by the United States is tearing up the World Trade Organization and all of its rules. So, and the U.S. has, behaved that way before with respect to Antigua and Barbuda when they refused to abide by a WTO tribunal, which ruled them violating Antigua and Barbuda's rights under the WTO. But they just don't care. Might is now right. It is explicit. Trump said, we could take out anybody. He said that today, literally. He said, our technology, we took out all of Venezuela, China and Russia's anti-aircraft missiles couldn't work. We could take out anybody, literally is what he said. And so might is absolutely right as far as he's concerned. And so in the context of this CARICOM unity, which is fragmented now, because the CARICOM countries are under tremendous pressure. The OECS countries have agreed to accept deportees from other countries from the United States. Say Kitts-Nevis put in a caveat, which was horrible, saying they're not going to accept any deportees from Haiti, which is a fellow CARICOM country. It's horrible. But all of them have agreed to accept deportees.
Okay, David, as you talk about Caribbean unity, let me bring in our audience here. As we promised, we have a comment from in our image 7506, and that person commented on the divide and rule, the unity, in other words, that you just mentioned there. That's why I'm reading it now. And the person said that divide and rule is alive and well. And of course, we know that's an age old imperialist, colonialist strategy that has worked very successful. The same person said in another text that my stance is that if you support the current USA regime, you're supporting white supremacism. David, I want to ask you this question in particular. Of course, Carole can answer as well. But I'm curious, and I'm sure other people are as well. What role exactly did the Trinidad and Tobago government play in the abduction and the abduction of Maduro, invasion of Venezuela? We know the raider in Tobago wasn't put there for monitoring drugs, but directly as an offensive weapon against Venezuela military technology. I heard in an interview by a former SEALs commentator that at least one of the helicopters flew out of Trinidad. That they came from different points, and one flew out of Trinidad, and he said it took 28 minutes to get to Caracas. That means we were directly involved much more than just giving lip service or whatever it is that the government, wants us to believe. So my question is, how can we know, David, exactly how can we know? Is the freedom of information invocable by anyone, by, NGOs? I believe the Guardian tried to invoke the FOI on some, I believe it was something related to this, but is there some way that we can find out what role Trinidad really played? We need to know. Yeah. We can't just exist in the dark. We need to know exactly, as bad as it might be, we need to know. Could you help us to answer that question?
Yes, well, we've always maintained that the radar was an integral part of the U.S. Surveillance system. Yes. The other thing is that there was a report in the newspaper on Sunday that a U.S. military plane landed at Piarco and took off during that period of time when the attack was taking place on Venezuela. Now, Caracas was not the only location that was attacked militarily. There were attacks on other states and military installations on other states, including states, and Shabaka probably knows the geography better than me, like Guira, which is closer to Trinidad than say Caracas is, right? Than say Caracas is, because on the east coast of Venezuela. And therefore, and the Minister of Defense, when he was questioned on that by the media, which was very good at a press conference, the Minister of Defense said he had no knowledge about Trinidad and Tobago being involved. So, they try to pretend that we were not involved. Those were the first statements that came out of the government after January 3rd. In fact, there was a press conference, I think, on the 4th of January. And what they were saying is, well, no Trinidad and Tobago was not involved because our military or police were not there. Of course, they were not there. But the fact that the government of Trinidad and Tobago had given the U.S. permission to use the airport at Piarco and in Tobago for U.S. military planes to enter and leave at any time meant that the U.S. had access to our airfields for when they wanted. Now, I don't know about the helicopter thing. I don't know about that. The SEAL said so. I saw another report coming out of the UK, which was very detailed on BBC last Sunday, or was it the Sunday before, when a military expert, a British military expert, described what had taken place, which I think is more accurate than what the SEAL said, because I don't know that a helicopter could get from Piarco to Caracas in 28 minutes. ATR, the turboprop takes 55 minutes, and a jet, where they used to run the jets, would have taken 45. I don't know that the helicopters are quicker than a jet. Maybe they are. I don't
Well,
know.
it may not be to Caracas, as you said, David. It might have been to a closer target as well. It could have been perhaps to a closer target as well. But the possibility, obviously, is there. And I heard Rubio mention Trinidad at the top of the list of the countries that facilitated the invasion. Right. Rubio mentioned Trinidad and Tobago as one of the most important governments that facilitated and supported the invasion. It could not be just the hosting of the raid. It must have gone beyond that.
Well, certainly the political support, but also the use of the airport. So that's why I'm saying that the information that came out in the Trinidad media, because they quoted the conversation between the air traffic controllers and the pilot of that US plane. So that plane did land and did take off. And now what it had on board, we don't know. Who it had on board, we don't know. And we're not going to get that information out of the government of Trinidad and Tobago. FOI, they will simply say that is national security, and they will blank you. And I don't think a court will try to overturn the government's position on that type of FOI. And therefore, it will have to come out of sources within the United States, military, that will eventually leak it. And that's how we're going to know ultimately where it's going to come from. But
I was about to say that, David, that it will come out because there's a level of U.S. journalism and U.S. official resistance sometimes that challenges and brings out the information. It will come out, and I think really soon. But I think the point is that the Trump playbook is lie, tell a lot of lies. There's nothing truthful. So I think we want to operate from the fact that there have been a series of untruths that are told to the public, and they will come out later on and you discover it was a big old lie. But just know the Trump playbook is lie. Lie about it until you figure out the next way to get out of that lie. But it doesn't matter because the context is that this lie then becomes almost a truth that sits there unless it's challenged. So we need to operate from the framework that we're operating in a context in which lies are normative by the various leaderships that we're talking about, including the Trinidadian one, including the one from the US. Because if she's following the Trump playbook, this is what I keep saying all the time, she's following the Trump playbook. Insult people, call them bad names, talk tough, cuss them out. Who wants to be that kind of person? And who wants to emulate that kind of horrendous behavior? I'm shocked. I'm really horrified by that.
Appalling stuff. Talking about appalling behavior, Brother Abdulah, let me give you an opportunity to respond to one of your critics here. Senator, the Honorable Philip Edward Alexander. I don't know if you've been reading any of his comments on the work that you're doing.
No, I really don't, because, according to Eric Williams, I mean, I'm not a fan of Dr. Williams, but he had a very good statement and said, "Let the jackass bray."
Right. I think we can leave
But tell
that
me
there.
what he said. But tell me what he said, so I could respond for the benefit of the listening audience.
All right. Well,
Yeah.
after the solidarity event, which we hosted outside of the Venezuelan embassy with the ambassador, he launched into a tirade on Facebook. It was carried on CNC Television's Facebook page, where he talked about. He said that you had this protest, and none of the people who you were protesting for showed up, meaning that there weren't any Venezuelans there, which sort of told the story of the reality. He says, "Where is your pious morality of rules? Where was your pious morality of rules when all these people were being, mistreated by the Maduro regime, having to flee the country and found themselves in sexual exploitation and so on?" He had a long rant, and then he said, he went on to say that you blame sanctions for the economic collapse in Venezuela, but you can't account for it's a long, I can't read the whole thing, but you get the impression. He's talking about the fact that his position is that the economic situation in Venezuela is the fault of the Venezuelans. The mass migration, which took place when the sanctions started to bite, is because of the human rights abuses of the Maduro government. And of course, people like yourself and myself and others who condemn the international the imperialism of the United States in this particular moment. We are hypocrites and what have you. What would you like to say to people like him?
Well, two things. I mean, he made us
Beyond telling the jackass is not to break.
Yeah. So some time ago, he made a statement. I remember he's a member of the government, albeit a junior minister, and he made a statement saying that if Venezuela tried to attack Trinidad and Tobago, India will bomb Venezuela. You remember that?
Yes, of course. Ludicrous.
And the Prime Minister herself had to say at a public function, Philip, that statement was really, paraphrasing, a foolish statement, and call him a child. That was a foolish statement, and tell him basically stay in your crease. So he's one to make all kinds of wild statements, and that is why I really don't take him on. And the fact of the matter is, and anybody could go and see what the UN special rapporteur for Venezuela had reported some time ago. I don't remember his name now. Shabaka, you may recall his name, about the impact of sanctions on the daily life of Venezuelans. And he said that those sanctions are really a violation of humanitarian law and so on, right? So that came not from David Abdulah, that came from the UN Special Rapporteur on Venezuela, who was sent by the Secretary General to understand exactly what was happening with those sanctions, which are illegal and illegitimate because they're not sanctions in furtherance of a UN Security Council resolution. Those are the only sanctions that could be considered internationally legitimate and legal. These are unilateral things that were implemented by the US, as the US has done to Cuba, and nearly every country in the world except for Israel and the United States has said that those sanctions should be removed, the blockade should be ended, but the US, because might is right, thumbs its nose at the international community.
Of course.
And incidentally, we had human trafficking into Trinidad and Tobago of women from not just Venezuela, but Colombia, Dominican Republic, long before Chavez.
Yeah, one of the things that
anybody who knew about all those cases of ill repute and so on will know about the human trafficking that took place long time ago. Had nothing to do with Chavista or Maduro.
I hear you there, Doctor. One of the things that the critics of the of President Nicolas Maduro and the Bolivarian Revolution point to are two reports, one out of the United Nations, I think, human rights body, which is supported by Amnesty International, which actually uses the term crimes against humanity. Have you seen that report?
I'm not sure which research report.
It was a report issued a few months ago. I actually confronted some of the directors of Amnesty International about it, and of course, you know, I mean, they were very happy when I first asked them about it, but when I challenged them on the question of crimes against humanity, they got very upset and didn't want to have a conversation anymore. But you know, they've used I don't know, I mean, but some of these organizations have used very strong language. And when you look at the details of the report, it's actually it boils down to maybe, you know, 12 political prisoners who cannot, according to them, are not receiving due process. And they've labeled this fact in these most outlandish terms. Something that we should look into, definitely. If you haven't read these reports, it's something to look into for future program discussion, because it's what the critics point to all the time.
Exactly.
And just let me just refer you to what was on the website dated the 7th of January. So this is subsequent to the military attack and the kidnapping of President Maduro and the First Lady, on the website of the United Nations Human Rights Office of the High Commissioner. And there was a report by a group of experts with respect to that military attack and the kidnapping. And they said very clearly that this was, they said, quote, "This unprecedented attack on Venezuela must not be viewed as an isolated incident, but rather as part of a broad and deeply troubling pattern of systematic disregard for peace, international law, and multilateral institutions," and so on. The return to gunboat diplomacy includes repeated acts of military aggression, extrajudicial killings, coercive diplomacy, the imposition of sanctions against judges and prosecutors of the International Criminal Court and a UN Special Rapporteur, and so on and so on. And they spoke about what the social crisis and humanitarian crisis that could arise in Venezuela as a result of this. So that is an important statement that came out of experts that looked at, and it's published on the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and so on. So they're very critical of the actions of U.S. imperialism in this regard.
All right, indeed. Yes. Right.
Yeah, perhaps, Shabaka, you can bring the program, wind the curtain down at this time, I suppose. And
yes. Okay. So I just want to say that, you know, in future programs, we will look more closely at some of these, you know, documents that are being quoted in the international media. I have one in front of me now. It's from January 3rd, 2026. It says it's a UN fact-finding mission which expresses grave concern following. Oh, that's the one that you were talking about. No, but there's one that's prior to that that speaks about, that uses the language of crimes against humanity. But we'll return to that in a future program. We want to thank you both, Dr. Carole Boyce-Davies and Brother David Abdulah, for joining us tonight on Indaba, and ask you guys to just give your closing remarks, what you would want to leave the Caribbean public with on this subject. What would you like them to remember, to consider as we go forward in this time of great uncertainty and instability?
Well, for me, as I started, Trinidad is a country that is known for being at the forefront of launching amazing Pan-Africanist, leftist, progressive positions. And the way that is representing now internationally, and I'm saying this because of the other person, Nicki Minaj, is that it's like this is an island that is very problematic because it has facilitated this invasion of Venezuela, and the capturing of its president. So I keep going back to its history and its Pan-Africanist branding, which is being really troubled. And we need to really stress that this is not Trinidad really at all. This is a particular government that has this particular agenda, and this is what's taking place. So we want to really be clear and really make sure we repeat this, because on the global scene, people who, this second generation who haven't read all that stuff, they don't know. They're just listening to what they hear on the media, right? And they don't understand this long history that we have of a very
So,
strong.
doctor, this is an anomaly for us. Then you want us to remember to think of it as an anomaly.
I would
And
definitely. I cannot buy any other argument on understanding Trinidad is such a sellout country. My God, I'd have to walk in shame for the rest. When you say Trinidad and Tobago, wherever you are, Howard, wherever,
oh,
there's a certain pride. Oh my God. And now you feel like when you say Trinidad and Tobago, they're like, oh, that country that was the place that launched, the
the
kidnapping of
coalition of the willing.
Right, like no. We can't go out like that at all. That's me. That's my position, and it's very self-interested, but also very largely political as far as my identity is concerned, and the Trinidadian identity and its history is concerned. We got to
Very
protect
good,
that
Dr.
history,
Davies.
y'all.
Brother Abdullah.
Yes, thanks, and thanks for having me on the program this evening. I want to share my concern about Cuba, because Marco Rubio, who is one of the architects of U.S. imperialism, Secretary of State and chair or what the director of National Security Council, whatever it's called in the U.S., is after Cuba. And because he came, of course, his parents were migrants from Cuba. And so he has a desire, objective of being the person to destroy the Cuban Revolution. And we have to defend Cuba with every ounce of our being. I talk about Pan-Africanism. Cuba was the country that sent its people to fight in Africa, that defeated the South African army, that therefore ensured the independence of Angola and Namibia and the eventual ending of apartheid, and also Mozambique, ensured that Mozambique survived as an independent country. So we cannot let Cuba go. And Cuba has done so much for us, scholarships for our people,
Yeah,
coaching
absolutely.
offers. Yeah.
Yeah, David, I think
yeah.
that it's important for our listeners to be clear, though, that because we're talking to people on the ground in Cuba. I've been talking to people on the ground in Cuba. I mean, the Americans are, right now at the center of orchestrating great suffering among our Caribbean brothers and sisters in Cuba. Great suffering, hunger, despair, lack of access to medication in a country that was once vaunted for its, its medical facilities and so on. I mean, they're causing great suffering. So, regardless of your, your loyalty to any particular political approach, what we're talking about here is human rights, abomination that in time the world will come to recognize as such. But for the time being, perhaps it's being swept under the rug. So I think we need to make that point clearly.
Sure, and that was the deliberate intention and objective of the blockade, as written black and white by the Undersecretary of State or whatever it was, Mallory, in 1961 when the blockade was being conceived by the United States. And he said that the objective is to create so much economic and social misery and hunger that the Cuban people will revolt against the government. That's the only way they could get rid of the government of Fidel Castro and the Communist Party. So it's clear that is what the objective of the blockade, and the blockade has been tightened and made worse in the last few years. And so you're right, and they're hoping, and they will send in agents and pay people to start protests and so on to try to agitate around people's real difficulties that they're experiencing in Cuba, the energy crisis that they're having. And I really hope that countries like Brazil and Mexico step up to the plate now and provide Cuba with a lot of the energy, the oil that they require. And countries like South Africa, China, and others come to provide very large material support for Cuba. I mean, South Africa owes Cuba, because without Cuba, South Africa would not have ended apartheid when it did. Mandela would not have been freed when he was. And those countries owe Cuba, and we, the Caribbean, also have to do what we have to do. That's one point. The other point is that, we have to continue to fight on the ground. Sister Zakia, Emancipation Support Committee's executive chair, Sister Abio Jackson, myself, we are working on a campaign that we will launch very soon to go on the ground with information why we should be a zone of peace around sovereignty, about what happened in Venezuela, with pamphlets and so on, and some other people will help us do short, Instagrams and TikToks and whatever it is to publicize it widely. We have to do a lot of education to combat the lies, the false narratives that are being pushed by the United States, by this government, and by people in the media who are spouting a lot of nonsense, including some out of the University of the West Indies, who should know better. Not you.
Well, I think that's a great note to end on there, brother. I think we've been comprehensive tonight. I want to thank both of you, and of course, Dr. Fergus, for that fantastic Africa report. Despite his challenges, we got a good sense of what we would have missed over the last couple months there when Indaba was off air. So thanks once again. We want to invite our listeners to join us once again next week, Wednesday, for another edition of Indaba. Same time, same place, right here, on the ESC channels.
Yes, indeed. I think we need to have a special session on Venezuela, Cuba. Perhaps Venezuela is the key that closes the door on the revolution. Perhaps that's the objective. So how can that be prevented? And I think David touched on an important thing there. How could the stalwarts on the left, the progressive stalwarts in the Caribbean, Brazil, on the South American continent, in Central America, how can they really come to the rescue of Cuba, at least to maintain the revolution? I too have heard some stories from people who have come from Cuba just last month, Shabaka, and the situation is dire. It is dire. The suffering that you talked about is real. And Venezuela, the situation there is going to make it worse unless something drastic happens.
Yeah. So I think we're gonna return to these conversations as we
Yes,
continue.
indeed.
It's glad to see you back.
So good night to the listening public, and see you next week for another exciting edition of Indaba. What can we project for next week, even from now, Shabaka? The hair issue is one of them.
Certainly, we will. We do have a sister who's doing some great work in St. Anthony's College. She's piloting a decolonial project in the education system. She's somebody that we can have on Indaba as well. So there's a lot to talk about. You just have to join us here on Indaba. It's once a week. You don't want to miss this program for sure.
Indeed. Good night. See you next week.